Welcome to Everyday Musicality, the podcast in which we discuss all things related to Gordon's music learning theory and how it can help unlock the inner musician that lives inside of all of us. I'm your host, Heather Shouldice, music educator and faculty member for the Gordon Institute for Music Learning. In this episode, we focus on bridging to the generalization level of inference learning from the verbal association level of the skill learning sequence. Hello and welcome to the Everyday Musicality podcast. Unfortunately, I have to start with a bit of sad news today. Marilyn Lowe has passed away. Marilyn was the author of the Music Moves for Piano series, a piano method based on Gordon's music learning theory. And she founded the piano track for the GIML Professional Development Levels courses. Her work has contributed so much to the piano world and to the MLT world. Our thoughts are with Marilyn's family and all who had the privilege of working with her and learning from her, and GIML will forever be grateful for the legacy Marilyn leaves behind. Rest in peace, Marilyn. In today's episode, I'm going to go back and finish up the mini-series of episodes I started last spring on the verbal association skill level. Way back in episode 41, I gave an overview of the verbal association skill level. In episode 42, I talked about choosing tonal and rhythm syllable systems to use in teaching at the verbal association level. In episode 43, I talked about tonal verbal association skills. In episode 44, I gave an overview of Gordon's system of classifying rhythm pattern function. And in episode 45, I talked about rhythm verbal association skills. I'll link to all of those in the show notes so you can find them easily if you'd like to go back and listen. Today, I'm going to talk about bridging from verbal association to the generalization level of inference learning in the skill learning sequence. Remember that the skill learning sequence is organized into two types of learning, discrimination learning and inference learning. The main differences between discrimination and inference learning are in what is learned and how it's learned. In the discrimination learning levels, students are working with familiar material, and the teacher is always modeling the skill or giving the answer before asking students to perform this skill or recognize the answer. So in discrimination learning, students are learning by rote, and the material is familiar. In the levels of inference learning, however, the students are dealing with unfamiliar material, and they are teaching themselves. They are independently figuring something out or creating something new. And the important thing to remember is that a student's success with inference learning directly depends on the quality and extensiveness of their discrimination learning experiences. In inference learning, students are teaching themselves what is unfamiliar by inferring from what is familiar. So discrimination learning provides the readiness for inference learning. That's something important to keep in mind. If your students are struggling with inference learning, it's often because they lack sufficient discrimination learning experiences, and they would benefit from returning to discrimination learning. It's also important to keep in mind, though, that things won't be perfect when we bridge from discrimination to inference learning. Remember that there are two ways of moving through the skill learning sequence. One way is via stepwise movement, which means that learning proceeds from one level to the next level immediately above or below it. So for example, if we move with content from oral and take that content to the verbal association level, that would be stepwise movement. The other way of moving through the skill learning sequence is via bridging movement. In bridging movement, learning temporarily moves from a level of discrimination learning to a level of inference learning. This allows students to try independently applying the knowledge and skills they developed through discrimination learning by figuring out or creating something new at inference learning. If you're feeling like you'd benefit from a quick overview of the skill learning sequence and all its levels, I talked about that back in episode 9, which I'll link to in the show notes. Today, I'm going to talk about bridging from the verbal association level to the generalization level. The essence of generalization is that students are teaching themselves. When we generalize, we are independently figuring out something that is unfamiliar based on what we've learned with familiar content. So the common underlying characteristic of all tasks at the generalization skill level is that students must learn new content without being told the answer or having the appropriate response modeled for them. So we can bridge from verbal association, where students are learning to sing or chant with syllables and are learning to label tonalities, meters, and functions. We could bridge from that level to the verbal sublevel of generalization. At the verbal sublevel of generalization, students are figuring out something new using syllables or labels. Now, one important thing to keep in mind is that when we bridge to a level of inference learning, we need to keep our expectations for what qualifies as success in perspective. Students will always experience more success at an inference level when it's approached through stepwise movement than by bridging movement. So when we bridge to inference learning with our students, we need to keep in mind, again, that it won't be perfect. However, just because students struggle doesn't mean they shouldn't be given the experience. Bridging to inference learning helps students develop more musical independence, and bridging from discrimination to inference learning gives students an opportunity to use what they have learned, and in doing so, strengthens what students have learned at the level they bridged from. By messing with the content at an inference level, it reinforces students' learning of that content at the discrimination level they had been at. So for bridging from verbal association to the verbal sublevel of generalization, that's a great way to reinforce students' skills with syllables that they learned at the verbal association level and the skills that they're developing in labeling tonalities, meters, and functions. Now let's get into some examples of ways we can engage students in bridging from verbal association to generalization. As I talked about back in episodes 43 and 45, one of the main skills students learn at the verbal association level is to perform tonal patterns with tonal solfege or rhythm patterns with rhythm syllables. If your students have been echoing patterns of a certain kind of content with syllables at verbal association, you could bridge to generalization by performing patterns of that same function on neutral syllables and asking students to associate tonal solfege or rhythm syllables as they echo the patterns. For example, let's say your students have been learning to sing familiar tonic and dominant patterns with solfege in major tonality at the verbal association level. You might decide to bridge to generalization by performing some unfamiliar tonic and dominant patterns in major on neutral syllables and asking students to sing them back with tonal solfege. Notice that I mentioned that students were learning to sing familiar patterns with solfege at verbal association, and then at generalization they would be asked to associate solfege to unfamiliar patterns. So students are taking that audiation vocabulary they've been developing at verbal association, and they're using that vocabulary to teach themselves something new at generalization. If students struggle, that's okay. Again, remember that students will never be as successful when bridging to inference learning as they would be if they'd approached it through stepwise movement. You as the teacher get to decide what you consider success when bridging to an inference level. So don't expect perfection. On the rhythm side of things, an example of bridging to generalization from verbal association would be if your students have been echoing duple, macrobeat, microbeat patterns with syllables at the verbal association level, you could bridge to generalization by chanting some unfamiliar duple, macro, micro patterns on neutral syllables and asking students to associate rhythm syllables as they echo them. When doing these kinds of activities, I like to call it translating with students. Before we do the activity, we might have a conversation about what translating means. I'll make the point that one person might speak English and another person might speak Spanish, so they wouldn't be able to talk with one another. But if we have another person who speaks both English and Spanish, they could translate back and forth to help those two people understand one another. And then I'll tell the students we're going to try doing some rhythm translating, and I'll usually demonstrate with a puppet. I chant a few patterns on ba and pretend to have the puppet echo each one and associate rhythm syllables to it, like this. Listen. Ba 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 ba. Do day do day do day do. Ba 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 ba. Do, do, day, do, day, do. Ba, 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 ba. Do, 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 day. And I'll tell the students, the puppet just translated my rhythms from buppas to do's and do days. Let's see if you can do it. I'll chant some rhythms on buppas, and your job is to chant them back and translate to the do's and do days. Here's a little example of what that might sound like with students.
Ba 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 ba. Do day, do day, do day, day, do. Ba 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 ba. Do day, do day, do day, do. Ba 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 ba. Do day, day, day. Awesome. Let's see who I can pick on. Ba 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 ba. Do day, do day, do day, do. Ba 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 ba. Oh, you got it. Let's see who else I can trick. Ba 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 ba. Couldn't trick her. Ba 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 ba.
That was some audio from a video from my classroom a while back. In that video, a group of third grade students were engaged in a learning sequence activity at the generalization verbal sublevel. You could probably hear that some of the students were accurate and some weren't, and that is totally normal. It just tells you as the teacher what the students need next. Do they need more of a challenge, or do they need more experiences at verbal association? I'll link to that video in the show notes in case you'd like to see what it looks like with kids. In addition to performing patterns with solfege, another skill students learn at the verbal association level is to recognize the tonality or meter of familiar repertoire. As I talked about back in episode 45 on verbal association rhythm skills, we teach students to recognize meter by modeling the microbeats with syllables and using the microbeat syllables as a tool. So for example, we teach students that when they are audiating do day, do day, do day, do day as the microbeats, they're audiating duple meter. And when you're audiating do-da-dee, 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 do-da-dee as the microbeats, you're audiating triple meter. When teaching a song or chant at the verbal association level, we would model chanting the microbeats with syllables and tell the students the name of the meter based on those microbeat syllables. Then we could ask students to chant the microbeats with syllables themselves while we perform the song or chant, and at the end we could ask, the microbeats were such and such, so what was the meter? Like, the microbeats were do day, so what meter was that song in? And students would remember the meter name you had already taught them. So the key here is that at verbal association, the teacher models the skill of chanting microbeats with syllables and naming meter before asking students to perform the skill or recognize the name of the meter. At verbal association, you're not asking students to figure out what the syllables for the microbeats would be. That would be generalization. At verbal association, again, the teacher always provides the answer or models the skill for students before asking them to try it. However, if we did want to bridge from verbal association to generalization, we could do an activity in which we take a song or chant for which we had never told students the meter or the microbeat syllables and ask them to figure it out. You could say to students, we've learned in the past that when the microbeats are do day, it's duple meter. And when the microbeats are do-da-dee, it's triple meter. Well, today it's going to be your job to figure out the meter of the song. While I sing the song, your job is to try moving to the macro and microbeats and decide whether you're audiating do day, or do-da-dee. At the end of the song, I'm going to ask you which microbeat syllables you thought fit. I would then sing the song and at the end gesture to the students to chant the microbeats with syllables that they thought fit with the song. Then I might ask them what the meter name would be. Instead of asking students to chant the microbeats with syllables first, another way you could do it would simply be to ask the students to listen and decide whether the meter is duple or triple. This leaves it to the students to figure out the microbeat syllables and then the meter name, which is a bit more demanding than asking them to figure out the syllables and then asking for the meter name. But either way, it's still generalization because you're asking students to figure out the meter to a song for which you'd never told them the meter before, or you're asking them to figure out the microbeat syllables that you've never told them before for that particular song. You could also do something similar with tonality. As I talked about back in episode 43 on verbal association tonal skills, we teach students to recognize tonality at verbal association by modeling the resting tone with solfege and then using that syllable as a tool. For example, we could teach students at verbal association that sol, la, sol, fa, mi, re, ti, do. When we're audiating do as the resting tone, we're audiating major tonality. And mi, fa, mi, re, do, ti, si, la. When you're audiating la as the resting tone, you're audiating minor tonality. So we associate the resting tone solfege syllable with the tonality name. When teaching a song at the verbal association level, we would model singing the resting tone with solfege for that song, and we would tell the students the name of the tonality based on the resting tone syllable. Then we could ask students to sing the resting tone with solfege at various points during the song, and at the end we could ask, we were audiating X as the resting tone, so what was the tonality? And students would remember the tonality name you had already taught them. So the key again is that at verbal association, the teacher models the skill of singing resting tone with solfege and naming the tonality before asking students to perform this skill. If you wanted to bridge to generalization, you could perform a song for which you had never taught students the resting tone solfege syllable or tonality name and ask them to figure it out. So you could say, we've learned in the past that when we're audiating sol, la, sol, fa, mi, re, ti, do, if we're audiating do as the resting tone, it's major tonality. And when we're audiating mi, fa, mi, re, do, ti, si, la, if we're audiating la as the resting tone, it's minor tonality. Well, today it's going to be your job to figure out whether the song is in major tonality or minor tonality. While I sing the song, your job is to decide whether you're audiating sol, la, sol, fa, mi, re, ti, do, or mi, fa, mi, re, do, ti, si, la. At the end of the song, I'm going to ask you which resting tone syllable you thought fit. I would then sing the song for the students and at the end gesture for them to sing the resting tone syllable they were audiating. Then I would ask them what the tonality name was. Now, one thing to be aware of is that if you're having students identify tonality or meter at the generalization level through bridging from verbal association, they may have a hard time, especially at first. This is where the partial synthesis level of discrimination learning comes in really handy. At partial synthesis, we're teaching students to recognize tonality or meter by modeling a song or series of patterns in the two tonalities or the two meters, showing the students which one is which and explaining to them why. And then we only perform those two examples and ask students to recognize which tonality or meter they're audiating. I'll be talking about partial synthesis more in an upcoming level, so stay tuned for that. Similar to asking students to identify the tonality or meter of an unfamiliar song, you could also ask students to identify the function of an unfamiliar pattern. For example, let's say students were learning to sing familiar major tonic patterns with solfege at verbal association and learning to label those patterns as major tonic function. In bridging to generalization, I might take this song. Ya-dum bum ba-dum bum, ya-dum bum ba-dum bum, ya-dum bum bum ba-dum bum, ya-da-da-da-da-dum ba-da-dum bum. Then I might say to the students, your job today is to be music detectives. Here's your clue, music detectives. Bum bum bum. What was that clue? Can you sing it? Bum, bum, bum. Now you're going to remember that clue. What was it again? Bum, bum, bum. See if you can find that clue in my song. What was the clue again? Bum, bum, bum. Here's my song. Bum, 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 ba-da-da-da-da-dum, ba-da-dum, bum. And then I might give students a couple repetitions to listen for that pattern. Bum, bum, bum. Maybe asking them to raise their hand every time they hear that pattern. Bum, bum, bum. Or count how many times they hear it. Now, so far in this activity, you could do this when bridging from oral to generalization because we haven't used any syllables or labels. But the next part adds verbal association. Next, I might ask the students to listen for that pattern in the song, bum, 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 and decide whether they're audiating it as major tonic or major dominant. Let's see what you think. What was the pattern again? Bum, 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 here's the song. Bum, 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 ya-da-da-da-da-dum, ba-da-dum, bum. So you could ask students to label whether they're audiating that pattern as major tonic or major dominant. You could also ask students to sing that pattern on solfege, to translate that pattern from the neutral syllables, bum, 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 to the solfege syllables, mi, so, do. And the idea here is that if previously students have been learning familiar patterns, like maybe they learn the pattern bum, 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 and then at verbal association, they learn that familiar pattern with the solfege, do, mi, so. Among other familiar major tonic patterns, of course, that they would be learning. But the idea is that by learning those patterns, including do, mi, so, when we bridge to generalization, we give them an unfamiliar pattern, bum, 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 that includes all of the pitches they've been learning in that tonic function at verbal association when they learn the familiar pattern, do, mi, so, and others. Then those are the tools that they can use to figure out that bum, bum, bum is mi, so, do. By the way, that little tune I was singing, I believe it's called Little Bird. It's by my friend and colleague Jennifer Bailey, who is also a GIML faculty member and one of the co-authors of our book, Q&A for MLT, General Music Perspectives on Music Learning Theory, available from sponsor GIA Publications. So these are just some of the ways that you can bridge from the verbal association level of discrimination learning to the verbal sublevel of the generalization level of inference learning. Of course, in this episode, I only talked about the bare bones basic ideas of how you could bridge to generalization, but of course, you could spice it up by making it playful. You could incorporate props. You could turn it into a game. There are all kinds of ways that you could get students practicing these generalization skills in playful ways. But again, the main gist is that students are using their verbal association skills to figure things out for themselves using syllables and labels at generalization. In the next episode, I'll talk about bridging from verbal association to the creativity improvisation level of inference learning. And don't forget, I would love to hear your favorite ideas for teaching skills at the oral or verbal association levels to feature in an upcoming listener suggestion episode. So please send those my way. It doesn't have to be long. You can email me a short description to everydaymusicality@gmail.com. Or better yet, record a short voice memo of yourself describing the activity and email me that voice memo so I can use the sound in the episode. And of course, if I share your idea, I'll be sure to give you a shout out in that episode. In the meantime, if you have questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, please get in touch. You can email me or send me a voice memo at everydaymusicality@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and let's keep musicking every day.